When decades-old snow suddenly melted, a quiet man from a northern settlement discovered something that shouldn't have existed on his land. The roof of an old house buried under ice for half a century. Subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. Would you dare to enter a house that spent 50 years trapped beneath the snow? The northern lands had always belonged more to winter than to any other season. Even in the warmest months, the cold clung to the ground as if reluctant to let go. Hills and valleys alike lay beneath layers of packed snow that had settled over decades, compressing into dense glacial slabs that shaped the very rhythm of life. The people who chose to live in this remote slice of America did so either out of stubbornness, heritage, or the desire to be alone. Winters could swallow entire months without a hint of sunlight, and summers, when they finally came, were short, pale imitations of warmth, hardly enough to thaw the earth beneath their boots. In such a world, the idea of seeing bare soil, untouched by snow for years, was as improbable as witnessing a river run backward. Tomas Harper had accepted this land's character long ago. In his mid-50s, gray at the temples and weathered by years of physical work, he had settled into a quiet existence on the outskirts of a sparsely populated settlement. His small wooden house stood alone, surrounded by open ground and thick pine forests, a good distance from the nearest neighbor. Once a lumberjack, Thomas knew the forest intimately, its seasons, its breath, its silence. Age and injuries had eventually pushed him out of the industry, leaving him with a modest pension and a collection of aches that lingered like unwelcome reminders of another life. Yet solitude suited him. Early mornings with a steaming mug of coffee, the faint hum of his old generator, the ritual of clearing a path through snow. These quiet functions of daily life anchored him to the world in a way nothing else really could. It was during one such morning ritual that he first noticed something unusual. The previous weeks had been marked by an odd shift in weather conditions. What should have been a cool, steady early summer had instead turned into an unexpected heat wave. Temperatures rose far beyond what was typical for the region, melting snow at an alarming rate. Tomas had never seen the like of it. Snow that had remained unmoved for years, snow that generations joked would outlive them all, now sank and sagged, forming rivulets of water that cut through the once frozen landscape. Pools gathered in places long believed permanently frozen. Even the air felt different, thinner somehow, as if the land itself exhaled after a long slumber. At first he paid it little mind. Nature was unpredictable. Even the coldest regions could experience strange anomalies. But as the thaw continued, revealing patches of darkened earth and submerged rock that had not seen daylight in decades, Thomas found himself increasingly drawn to the transformation taking place on his own property. The boundary of his land sloped downward slightly, and it was there along the rim, where the snow had been deepest and most compacted, that he noticed the first sign of something unnatural. It started as a line, a perfectly straight, sharply defined line cutting through the melting snow. Tomas paused, shovel in hand, uncertain if he was seeing it correctly. Nature did not draw straight lines. Wind-carved swirls, snowdrifts rose and fell unpredictably, ice cracked in chaotic patterns. But this line was precise, intentional, and dark. The melting snow revealed more each day, and with every passing afternoon, the mystery grew. Soon another edge appeared, forming a right angle. The two lines met like the corner of a buried box or structure. Thomas crouched beside it and brushed away the slush with a gloved hand. Beneath he felt something hard, flat, and man-made. He stood back, his breath catching slightly in the warm air. He had lived on this land for years, tended it, walked it, shoveled it, and never once had he suspected anything lay beneath the surface. The idea that a structure, any structure, could rest hidden under so many years of accumulated snow was unimaginable. Yet there it was, gradually emerging under the unrelenting heat. A line became a corner, and a corner became an unmistakable slope. By the third day, the truth was undeniable. Tomas was looking at a roof. It sat at a shallow angle, covered in layers of discolored shingles and debris trapped between time and ice. Meltwater trickled down its surface, revealing the dull brown beneath the grime. A chimney protruded near the far end, cracked and crooked as if frozen mid-collapse. The more he studied it, the more he felt that quiet, steady prickle of unease in the back of his neck. Roofs meant houses, and houses meant people. But no house had stood here during his lifetime, nor in the memories of those who had lived here longer than he had. He remembered then, faintly, whispers he had once overheard at the local bar, older men telling stories about the avalanche that had swept through the region decades ago. Several homes had been destroyed or lost, swallowed up by snow and debris. Bodies had been recovered, most of them, but there were those who had never been found. The land had simply taken them. Over time, the stories faded into legend, the precise details forgotten. Tomas had never given them much thought, until now. The roof continued to reveal itself inch by inch, as if rising from a grave of ice. Tomas felt both drawn to it and strangely reluctant to touch it. Something about disturbing what had been entombed for decades brought a heaviness to his chest. But curiosity, persistent and steady, pushed him to investigate further. He needed to uncover the truth, and to do that, he would need more than a shovel. His old excavator, a machine he rarely used but maintained out of habit and foresight, stood in the tool shed behind his house. The yellow paint was faded, and rust warmed its joints, but the engine still started after a few stubborn attempts. Thomas drove it toward the buried roof with careful, deliberate motions. The machine groaned against the mud but moved steadily, its metal bucket poised like a question waiting for an answer. He began clearing the accumulated snow and ice around the structure, working slowly to avoid causing any damage. Each load he scooped away exposed more of the house beneath. Walls emerged, wooden, weather-beaten, yet largely intact thanks to the insulating prison of snow. Window frames appeared, their glass shattered or long ago lost. The outline of the house became visible in full, lying in a slight depression, as though the earth had taken it in and held it tightly. Then he saw the door. It was almost fully uncovered by now, sitting at a crooked angle beneath the weight of the land. Yet it remained whole, its paint chipped but recognizable. A cold gust of memory swept through him, stories of families trapped, buried, unheard. He swallowed hard, unsure what he might find behind it once he forced it open. As the last of the ice fell away from the threshold, Tomas stepped back and shut off the excavator. The machine fell silent, leaving only the sound of distant water running through the thawing ground. The air felt heavier, as though the past itself was gathering just out of reach, waiting for him to take the next step. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the door, fully aware that whatever lay beyond it had been hidden not just by snow but by time itself. He could not shake the feeling that he was about to trespass into someone else's frozen story, a story that had never been meant to resurface. But the thaw had come, and it had revealed what the land had kept for decades. With a slow breath, Tomas approached the uncovered entrance, his hand brushing against the cold, weathered wood. The past had risen to meet him, and now it waited. The uncovered doorway stood before Tomas like the mouth of a long-buried secret. After the days spent exposing the structure beneath the thawing landscape, he found himself staring at the faded wooden door with a quiet reverence, uncertain of what lay beyond it. The harsh sunlight softened against the ice-slicked exterior of the house, casting pale reflections across the ground. It made the place feel strangely suspended between the present and the past, as though time had forgotten it long before the snow ever did. The air was still around him, holding its breath in anticipation as he reached for the handle. The wood was stiff beneath his glove, swollen from decades of pressure and dampness. Tomas pressed his shoulder against the door and pushed, slowly, carefully. At first it resisted, as if refusing to give up the secrets it had held for so long. Then with a reluctant groan, it shifted inward. A cold breath exhaled from within, carrying with it a stale scent of dust, age, and something frozen in its essence. He lifted his flashlight and stepped inside. The first thing he noticed was the silence, thick, absolute silence that clung to the walls like frost. His light swept across a small entryway before spilling into the main room, revealing a scene that felt both eerily familiar and utterly foreign. It was a home, undeniably, but one abandoned abruptly, as though the occupants had stepped out with the intention to return in the next moment and simply never did. The living room lay ahead, dim and perfectly still. The furniture was arranged as one might expect in an ordinary household. A couch with sunken cushions, a pair of armchairs, a wooden coffee table resting slightly askew atop a once bright rug now dulled by time. The fabric of the furniture had stiffened, the colors faded, and the air around everything carried the musty, heavy scent of long confinement. Dust coated nearly every surface, yet beneath the layer of age there was an intactness that unsettled him. Nothing here bore the jagged violence one would expect from a house crushed by a natural disaster. He walked through slowly, the soft crunch of frost beneath his boots echoing faintly. His flashlight drifted across the old television set, one of those with a rounded screen encased in polished wood. A ceramic lamp stood beside it, its shade yellowed, its cord trailing uselessly behind a small side table. On the wall hung framed photographs, their glass fogged but still clear enough to reveal the smiling faces of a family. A man with strong, serious eyes and a woman with gentle features sat with two children, a boy who appeared no older than 8 or 9, and a younger girl, both grinning in the soft certainty of childhood. Tomas paused before one of the photographs, running his fingers lightly along the frame. The image felt too alive, too immediate. It unsettled him more than the stillness of the house itself. The children's faces, frozen mid-laughter, seemed to echo faintly in the cold air, as though calling across time. He lowered the picture and moved deeper into the house. The kitchen offered a sharper sense of urgency. Pots and pans remained on the stove, their enamel chipped and darkened. The cabinets were left slightly open, revealing dishes neatly arranged inside. A cup lay on its side near the sink, as if someone had placed it down too quickly. The small kitchen table had papers spread across it, notes, newspapers, envelopes that had once been crisp, but were now softened and curled from prolonged exposure to cold. Everything carried the unmistakable signature of haste, of interrupted routine. He crossed into a hallway that branched towards several rooms. The first he entered was a bedroom that must have belonged to the parents. The bed stood unmade, not in a messy way, but in a sense that someone had pulled the covers back hurriedly, perhaps in the dark hours of an early morning, or in the frantic moments before an unexpected departure. Clothes hung in the open closet, all decades out of fashion. A pair of boots sat by the foot of the bed, still upright, ready to be worn. He moved on to the next room, a smaller space filled with toys and books scattered across the floor. It belonged to a child likely the boy from the photograph. A wooden train track lay abandoned near the wall, a toy car resting halfway along its loop. A small dresser bore stickers peeling around the edges, and beside it, a slightly crooked shelf held children's books with frayed covers. One had fallen open on the floor, its pages stiff from the cold but surprisingly intact. The child must have left abruptly, too. His world remained exactly where he had dropped it. Across the hall lay another child's room, this one unmistakably belonging to a girl. The remnants of dolls, ribbons, and tiny trinkets decorated the dresser. A stuffed animal, once soft and plush, lay slumped against the headboard, frozen in posture and expression. Thomas felt an involuntary tightening in his chest. These rooms held the ghosts of lives interrupted, not by violence or debris, but by something quieter and more deliberate. As he explored further, the sense of urgency began to sharpen into something more pointed. These people had not been caught by surprise, they had left intentionally, yet they had left much behind. There were too many signs of impulsive preparation, things half-packed, items abandoned mid-use, and furniture shifted out of alignment, as though providing hurried access to hidden corners. It wasn't until he reopened the door leading to the small pantry at the back of the hallway that he discovered something more definitive. The cramped space, lined with aging shelves and empty jars, seemed ordinary at first glance. But when he crouched to examine the lower part of the wall, his flashlight caught something off-color. A section of planks appeared newer, less weathered, their nails cleaner than the surrounding wood. That incongruity made his pulse quicken. He leaned closer, touching the wood. Yes, these boards were different. With cautious pressure, he pried at one of them. The planks shifted with surprising ease and came free, revealing a small cavity behind it. Enough room for a box. Tomas pulled the container forward. It was a cardboard box, worn but not deteriorated. Inside lay a disturbing arrangement of old papers, brittle envelopes, loan agreements, newspaper clippings, and letters with harsh words scrawled in thick ink. Some of the envelopes bore threatening language. Others contained demands for repayment, interest rates so steep they bordered on criminal. There were notes that carried an unmistakable tone of menace, the kind of threats made by desperate men or dangerous ones. The implications struck him immediately. This family had not simply been unlucky victims of a natural disaster. Something had driven them toward fear, toward urgency. Something had pushed them to act quickly and without regard for the normal rhythms of life. And something had inspired them to hide their most incriminating or important documents behind a hastily built false wall. He placed the board back over the opening, but kept the box in hand. The weight of it felt symbolic, as though he held not just paper, but the fractured truth of a family's last days in this home. His mind played through possibilities, each one leading him away from the simple, tragic narrative he had once believed. These people did not die in the avalanche, or at least not in the way the town had assumed. He set the box aside and finished searching the house, moving with quiet purpose. In the back room, he found a calendar pinned to the wall. Its pages had frozen in place, but he could still make out the markings on the last month. Several dates circled, one with a faint, nearly absent-minded line drawn across it, the day before the avalanche. The deeper he studied the house, the clearer the emerging picture became. This was not the aftermath of a random disaster. It was the preserved fragment of a desperate escape, of a family who knew something terrible was coming, not from nature, but from men. By the time the daylight began to fade and Tomas finally stepped out of the house, the world outside seemed strangely altered. The sun hovered low, casting a long, cold shadow across the exposed structure. The surrounding ground, still damp from the ongoing thaw, smelled of wet earth and secrets long entombed. He held one of the photographs in his hand, a picture of the family seated together on the front steps of the home. They looked so ordinary, so unaware of the storm gathering around them. As he walked back toward his own house, cradling the box of documents under his arm, Tomas felt the first shift in his understanding. The avalanche had not simply claimed a home. It had buried a story, one left unfinished, unresolved, and waiting to be unearthed. Now that it had surfaced, he felt compelled to follow its trail, no matter where it led. The house had woken something in him, something that demanded answers. The past was no longer buried, and Thomas knew he had only stepped into the first shadow of its truth. The night after Thomas first stepped into the hidden house was restless. Long after he had returned to his own home, shadows of the past clung to his mind, drifting through every corner of his thoughts. He placed the box of documents on his kitchen table and sat before it for hours, studying each piece with meticulous care. The loans with impossible terms, the threatening letters scrawled with desperation or malice, the newspaper clippings mentioning small financial incidents that might seem trivial alone, but painted a darker picture when assembled together. All of it formed a mosaic of a man crushed under growing pressure. Thomas could see now that this was no simple story of a family lost to nature. Something else, something deliberate and human, had encircled them long before the avalanche came. The truth, once buried as deeply as their home, was beginning to thaw. Even as he tried to sleep, the images of the children's rooms tugged at him, the toys left mid-play, the half-packed bag, the overturned chair. These small remnants of frantic departure haunted him more than any threatening letter could. He found himself imagining the last night the family had spent in that house, the charged atmosphere of fear and urgency that must have filled every corner of their home. How could a family so clearly on the verge of escape suddenly vanish without any trace? The official story no longer made sense. The avalanche, once perceived as the cause of their disappearance, now felt more like a curtain drawn across the truth. The next morning, with little rest behind him, Tomas returned to the house. The sun had risen weakly, casting pale light over the exposed structure, illuminating the frost still clinging to its windows. He stepped through the door once again, the familiar chill pursuing him as he crossed each threshold. Every room he passed seemed to hold its breath, preserved in a state of frozen anticipation. The house waited, quietly urging him deeper into its secrets. He made his way to the upper level of the house where a narrow staircase led to the attic. The steps creaked under his weight, not with fresh instability, but with the fatigue of years suspended in cold silence. Reaching the top, he pushed aside the lightweight attic door. Dust and frost swirled through the air as he stepped inside. The attic space was cluttered with old trunks, cardboard boxes, worn luggage, and scattered belongings that had once been stored away with casual intention. Time had turned everything into relics. The dim light filtering through a small, ice-covered window barely illuminated the heaps of forgotten objects. Thomas moved cautiously, brushing aside cobwebs as he examined the aging boxes stacked against the wall. One box held children's winter clothes. Another contained old Christmas decorations wrapped in brittle newspaper. A faint smell of age and dampness permeated the space, mingling with the cold. He was about to turn back when something caught his eye. A cylindrical object, partly hidden behind a pair of abandoned suitcases, rested on the floor, unremarkable in shape but placed with too much care to have been tossed there by chance. He approached and knelt beside it. It was a rolled piece of thick paper, tied lightly with a faded string. He lifted it, surprised by how intact it was compared to the other forgotten things. Paper stored in such conditions should have warped or crumbled, yet this one seemed deliberately protected. Untying the brittle string carefully, he unrolled the sheet across a nearby trunk. At first glance, he recognized it as a map, but not like any printed chart he had ever seen. It was drawn by hand, the lines steady and deliberate, marked in pencil and faded ink. The region was vaguely familiar, a vantage point that corresponded roughly to the valley, the forest, and the hills beyond. But there were additions he had never seen on any official map. Trails drawn with meticulous detail, narrow pathways winding through the forest, and certain markings that suggested knowledge of the terrain far more intimate than casual use would require. A bolder, darker line cut across the map from the marked location of the house and stretched deep into the wooded mountains. Beside it were small handwritten notes, short, cryptic phrases such as "faster this way" or "not safe," their meaning blurred over time. One corner of the map bore a simple phrase written in the same hand. "In case it comes to this." Tomas leaned closer. Whoever had drawn this map had not intended it as a guide for hiking. It was a route planned with care, secrecy, and urgency. A route meant for escape. He traced his finger along the bold path, imagining the terrain, imagining the man who had drawn it. It did not take much imagination to understand what was happening here. The father of the family, surrounded by fears of debt and threats to his safety, had made a contingency plan. He had mapped out a way for his family to flee without being detected, through routes that would avoid roads, towns, and the eyes of those who might have been looking for him. This was a plan formulated not in the face of nature, but in the face of human menace. He folded the map gently and carried it downstairs. If this family had prepared such a detailed escape route, then perhaps they had known the avalanche was coming. Perhaps they had used it. He set the map beside the documents and photographs in the living room, and then felt a sudden resolve. He needed confirmation of something outside of his own interpretation. That meant historical records, old newspapers, archived reports. Somewhere in the fading echoes of the town's memory would be a clue. Later that day, Tomas locked the house behind him and drove to the nearby settlement, a town that seemed frozen in a slower rhythm than the rest of the world. Its small library sat at the corner of the main street. The librarian, an elderly woman with a quiet, watchful demeanor, recognized him instantly. He explained briefly that he was looking into the avalanche from decades ago. Without asking why, she led him to a section of dusty cabinets filled with newspaper archives and old microfilm. For hours, Thomas sifted through brittle pages, seeking any mention of the family. Articles described the avalanche as a sudden and devastating force of nature. Several homes had been lost, and while most victims were recovered, a few, the Nolan family among them, one article said, were never found. But before the tragedy, smaller notices appeared. A truck belonging to a man named Henry Nolan had been involved in a financial dispute. Another article described minor legal troubles concerning his business, referencing unsettled accounts and unknown associates. One clipping struck Thomas with particular force. It mentioned that neighbors of the Nolan family had reported odd visitors to their home shortly before the avalanche. Men unfamiliar to the community, arriving late in the evening, staying briefly, and leaving with tense expressions. The implication was subtle but clear. The Nolan family had been facing severe pressure. The article ended with a short statement from a local official, suggesting that personal issues may have contributed to their reclusive final weeks. Thomas gathered the photocopies and returned home, his thoughts weaving into a cohesive narrative. The map, the threatening letters, the hurried state of the house, the pieces aligned with chilling precision. This family had been planning to run. The avalanche had not been the cause of their disappearance, but may have served as a shield, an opportunity to vanish without leaving a trail. He laid the map out once more, letting his eyes follow the route toward the mountains. Somewhere along that path, only the family's fading footprints could answer the unanswered questions. A weight settled on him as he glanced at the photograph of the two children. Their cheerful faces now carried a haunting resonance. If the family had run, what had become of them? Did they reach safety? Were any of them still alive? As the last of the afternoon light dimmed, casting long shadows across the exposed roof outside, Thomas realized he could not leave the mystery buried again. He felt a pull, a responsibility to follow the story wherever it led. The discovery had set something into motion, something as unstoppable as the thaw itself. And in the silence of that old house beneath its thick veil of history, he sensed that the next clue waited patiently for him to uncover it. The evening settled slowly over the valley as Thomas returned from the town library, carrying the weight of knowledge he had not expected to find. The air had cooled again, though not enough to reverse the thaw, and the wind moved across the exposed house with a low, mournful hum. Inside his own kitchen, the photocopied articles and the fragile box of documents lay spread across the table, illuminated by the soft glow of a single lamp. The handwritten map rested at the center, its edges curling gently upward as though eager to reveal more. Thomas stood over it for a long time, absorbing every detail as he traced the bold line of the escape route once again. Now that he understood the context, the debts, the threats, the shadowed visits by unknown men, the map felt almost like a testimony. It was not a path chosen lightly or recklessly. It was the path of desperation, a last resort drafted by a man who had likely seen no other way to protect his family. The photograph of the children lay beside the map. Their young faces brought an ache to Thomas's chest, a mixture of sorrow and curiosity. If the family had indeed fled before the avalanche struck, where had they gone? Had they survived the harsh wilderness beyond the forest? Had the father succeeded in keeping his children safe? Or had they perished in the cold silence of the mountains, their final story erased by the shifting snows? These questions refused to release him, pressing deeply into his thoughts like roots seeking soil. As he stood contemplating the evidence, a memory tugged at him, the silver ring he had found tucked between the floorboards upstairs. It lay now on the table, its once bright surface tarnished by years of entombment. The name engraved inside it, Daniel, had lingered in his mind as persistently as the picture of the child. He picked it up, turning it slowly between his fingers. The ring was small, clearly made for a young boy's hand, and precious enough to have been kept close even in times of fear. Its presence in the house suggested it had either been dropped during the family's hurried departure, or perhaps left behind with intention. Either possibility hinted at the turmoil of their final hours in the home. A quiet resolve formed within Thomas. If any trace of the family remained in the living world, he wanted to find it. Maybe it was a foolish impulse. Maybe it was the loneliness of his own life reaching out to a mystery rich with human emotion. But the thought of the children, now adults, if they had lived, compelled him with a force he could not dismiss. Someone deserved to know the truth of what had happened. Someone deserved to reclaim the broken fragments of a story buried too long. The next morning dawned with a pale, muted light, and Thomas returned to the old house. The air inside still held its familiar chill, and the rooms remained unchanged as though time itself had frozen in solidarity with the abandoned home. He carried the ring in his pocket and began searching once more for anything he might have missed. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots as he moved from one room to another, his eyes scanning corners and forgotten spaces with renewed purpose. It was in the small bedroom, the one that had clearly belonged to the boy, that he sensed something he had not noticed before. A toy car lay beside the bed, its paint chipped, its wheels stiff from cold. The placement felt too deliberate, as if the child had dropped it in a moment of panic. Tomas crouched, examining the area more closely. When he lifted the toy, he glimpsed a faint indentation in the wooden floor beneath it. Running a finger along the groove, he realized it had been caused by the ring, likely falling from a pocket when the child had knelt or crawled hurriedly. A simple detail, yet it anchored his sense that the boy had left in haste and perhaps fear. Outside, the sky was shifting again, clouds gathering in slow, heavy formations. Tomas left the room and stepped out onto the porch. The earth around the house, once buried under decades of snow, was now wet and soft. The thaw revealed everything: imperfections, remnants, truths hidden for years. He stood for a while, listening to the rhythm of melting water dripping from the eaves, then returned home to begin the next stage of his search. He turned on his computer, a device he rarely used except for practical errands, and opened the local community forum. It was a small platform with modest activity, mostly neighbors sharing weather updates, lost pets, or community events. With a steady hand, he composed a post, careful not to sensationalize what he had found. He described the discovery of a long-buried house on his property, noted the family name, and mentioned the silver ring with the engraved child's name. He attached a few modest photos: the ring, the attic map, the childhood bedroom, and the family photograph he had found on the living room wall. He hesitated before clicking post. The house had survived decades untouched. Now he was bringing its story into the present world. With a deep breath, he hit the button. At first, nothing happened. Hours passed with the quiet hum of his home filling the space. He brewed coffee, tended to his tools, stepped outside to check the condition of the ground near the buried house. Each time he returned to the computer, the post remained still. Late that afternoon, the first response appeared, a brief reply from an elderly woman remembering the Nolan family and expressing sadness at their presumed fate. Then came more comments, some recalling vague memories, some surprised that the house still existed. People speculated, reminisced, wondered. But none of it brought Thomas closer to the truth. It was not until evening approached that a private message arrived. A notification blinked at the bottom corner of the screen. Thomas opened it. The message was short at first, almost hesitant. "I saw your post. I think I might know something. My name is Daniel. I may have had a ring like that when I was a child." Thomas's breath caught. The room seemed to still around him. He leaned in, studying the message carefully. There was no elaboration, no details. Only that cautious introduction. He replied gently, explaining how he had found the ring, the photos, and the condition of the house. He attached the photograph of the boy again. Minutes stretched into tense silence before another message arrived. "I remember that house, not clearly, but parts of it. The hallway, the window in the kitchen. I thought I imagined those memories." Tomas reread the words several times, feeling a strange combination of awe and gravity. He typed a careful response, offering what he knew from the archives, describing the documents he had found and the map. Slowly, the conversation expanded. The man on the other end of the screen confessed that he had always suspected his past was more complicated than he had been told. He remembered a sister, though they had been separated at a young age. He remembered snow. He remembered fear. He said he lived several states away now. He had spent years trying to piece together fragments from dreams and flickers of memory, but had never found anything concrete. Seeing the photograph and ring shook him in ways he struggled to describe. Finally came the message Thomas had hoped for, though he felt the weight of it the moment he read it. "I need to come there. I need to see the house." Thomas agreed, offering the time and place, telling him he would not touch or disturb anything further until he arrived. The conversation ended with a quiet gratitude, though beneath the words lay a tremor of apprehension shared by both men. The next 2 days passed in slow anticipation. Each morning, Thomas visited the house again, tidying pathways, ensuring nothing shifted or collapsed. He made no changes inside, understanding that any alteration could disrupt the fragile connection between the man and his buried past. In his own home, he reread the messages again and again, imagining what the journey must mean for the man who called himself Daniel. On the evening of the second day, as the last pale threads of sunlight faded behind the mountains, Tomas stood beside the uncovered house, waiting. The air was still, the world tinted in muted blues and grays, the silence broken only by the distant sound of dripping meltwater. In the quiet, he felt the shared gravity of two timelines, one present, one long lost about to converge. Soon, down the gravel road, a pair of headlights appeared, cutting through the deepening dusk. The car approached slowly, hesitantly, like someone nearing a place they had only seen in dreams. Thomas stepped forward, heart thudding with an ache he could not quite name. Daniel had come home. The car rolled to a stop a few yards from the house, its headlights washing over the exposed structure before slowly dimming as the engine quieted. For a moment, neither man moved. Tomas watched as the driver's side door opened with a hesitant slowness, and a tall figure stepped out into the cold air. Daniel stood for a long moment with his hands at his sides, his gaze fixed on the darkened silhouette before him. The evening light softened his features, revealing a man in his mid-40s, his posture stiffened by tension, uncertainty, and something deeper, an emotion Thomas recognized as quiet dread, mixed with the fragile hope of recovering something long lost. When Daniel finally approached, the gravel beneath his steps gave a faint, steady crunch. He stopped beside Thomas without speaking, his eyes never leaving the house. Thomas could see the tremor in his breath as he looked up toward the crooked roofline, the frost-choked windows, the door that had been closed to the world for decades. The weight of memory, or fragments of it, pressed visibly through Daniel's expression. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel," Daniel murmured, his voice low and strained, though he seemed to be speaking more to himself than to Tomas. "But I think I've seen this before." They moved toward the entrance. Tomas lingered just behind Daniel, offering silent support as he pushed the door open. The familiar scent of cold dust, stale air, and aged wood drifted out, carrying with it the remnants of lives that had frozen in place long before either of them had set foot inside. Daniel stepped in cautiously, as if he feared that even a breath too deep might fracture some invisible link he was only beginning to reestablish. Inside, the house felt different now, not because anything had changed, but because of the presence of someone who had once walked these halls as a child. Daniel's footsteps were slow and deliberate as he moved into the living room. He let his eyes trace each detail, the faded couch, the turned-over armchair, the television with its dusty screen. His breath came unevenly, almost shallow, and Tomas watched as recognition flickered across his face. "I remember that window," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. "I used to sit there with my sister. I think—" His hand lifted slightly, hovering near the windowsill before withdrawing, as though physically touching it might shatter the fragile vision forming in his mind. He moved deeper into the house, pausing at the toys scattered across the children's bedroom floors. He crouched beside the wooden train on the boys' bedroom floor, tracing the outline of the track with a trembling hand. A small, almost pained smile softened his expression. "My father gave me this train," he said, and the words seemed to surprise even him. He fixed it for me once. There was a broken wheel. I remember crying because I thought it was ruined." He paused, lowering his head. "He stayed up late to fix it, even though my mother said he should sleep." These memories came in small, delicate pieces, like shards of glass shifting under lamplight, fragile, but undeniable. Tomas remained silent, letting the moment unfold without intrusion. Daniel moved on, each room unlocking more fragments. In the kitchen, he froze again, staring at the table strewn with scattered papers. He placed a hand on the back of the nearest chair, gripping it as though needing support. "My mother used to hum here," he said quietly. "She always had music in her voice. I didn't remember that until now." His steps gradually carried him toward the bedroom that had once belonged to his parents. The unmade bed, the open closet, the boots by the foot of the mattress, everything remained untouched, preserved under the long anesthesia of ice and time. For a moment, Daniel simply stood in the doorway, shoulders sloping with an invisible weight. Then hesitantly, he crossed the threshold and picked up a faded scarf draped across a dresser drawer. He held it between his fingers, inhaling faintly, as if hoping to recover a scent swallowed long ago. "My mother wore this," he whispered, his voice tight. "She used to wrap it around her neck when she stood outside in the morning. I think I remember her bending down to tie my boots." The memories seemed to rise from the walls themselves, filling the room with echoes of the life that had once thrived here. Tomas felt like an observer standing at the edge of an unfolding past, a past not his own, but one he had inadvertently unearthed. Later they returned to the living room, where Daniel lowered himself onto the edge of the couch. He held the silver ring in his palm, tracing the engraved name slowly with his thumb. The weight of it seemed to ground him, drawing him deeper into the truth he had traveled so far to find. "I never understood why my childhood felt like pieces of a story someone tore out of a book," he said. "The earliest memories I have, they felt like dreams. I was told I had been adopted, that my parents couldn't care for me, but that never felt right. Something in me always knew that wasn't the whole truth." Tomas sat quietly across from him, the house's dim light casting long shadows on the floor. He knew this moment was the turning point where the fragments of Daniel's memories would need to align with the cold facts waiting to be spoken. "When you reached out," Daniel continued, "I didn't know if this was going to hurt me or help me. But now that I'm here, now that I see this place, I think I know what I didn't before." He exhaled slowly, steadying himself. "My father didn't abandon us. He tried to save us." The words hovered in the air, heavy with recognition and sorrow. Tomas nodded, offering the documents he had found in the wall. Daniel sorted through them methodically, loan statements, handwritten threats, notes scrawled with mounting desperation. His hands trembled as he read, his gaze growing darker with each letter. "My father was in trouble," he said quietly. "Deep trouble. He must have known these people were going to hurt us. My mother, she must have known too." He folded one letter carefully, setting it aside. "These men would have come here for us." He must have believed the avalanche was the only way out. The truth was harsh, but logical. The avalanche had not been a catastrophe that struck them unprepared. It had been the moment they embraced, willingly or reluctantly, as cover. A natural disaster turned into a shield. Daniel opened the map next. He stared at it for a long time, letting the lines and annotations speak. "He planned it," he murmured. "He mapped the safest paths, the places where no one could follow. This wasn't a panicked escape. This was thought out for weeks, maybe months." His jaw clenched. "They left that night, didn't they? Before everything collapsed." "They did," Thomas said softly. "There's nothing in the house to suggest they died here. And the avalanche buried everything before anyone could know." Daniel nodded slowly. "I remember the cold, and my mother coughing. I remember a cabin, a small one, and snow everywhere. My sister," his voice cracked. "She cried a lot." He lowered his face into his hands, his voice trembling. "I didn't imagine it. I didn't imagine any of it." When he looked up again, tears shone in his eyes. "My mother died out there, didn't she?" His voice softened to a near whisper. "I remember someone covering her with a blanket of snow." Tomas felt the heaviness of the moment settle deep in his chest. "You survived," he said gently. "Whatever they endured, they did it to save you." Daniel swallowed, struggling to steady his breath. "My father, what happened to him?" There was no clear answer, only the fragments Daniel himself could recall. "He left one day," Daniel murmured, "and he never came back. I always thought he walked too far, or maybe the cold took him. My sister and I were found later, separated by then. Different families." He closed his eyes briefly. "Now I understand why." The truth emerged not in one striking revelation, but in the slow, painful alignment of memories, documents, and the silent testimony of the house. The Nolan family had not died in the avalanche. They had fled into an unforgiving wilderness, carrying what hope they had left. Daniel sat back, breathing deeply, the emotional storm gradually settling into a quiet, solemn calm. He looked toward the window again, toward the broken line of mountains in the distance. "I don't know what I expected to find," he said, "but I think I found it." Thomas nodded, understanding more deeply than words could explain. The discovery had not only resurrected the story of a family, It had returned to Daniel the missing pieces of his identity. The house stood silent around them, holding its breath in reverence for the truth it had revealed. Outside, the last light of day faded beyond the horizon, leaving only the soft glow of Thomas's flashlight reflecting off the frost-covered walls. Together, the two men stepped outside. The air was still cold, but no longer hostile, just a gentle reminder of the world that had once taken so much from the Nolan family. As Thomas closed the door behind them, he felt the chapter of silence ending at last. The truth that had been buried deeper than snow was finally free. The cold evening light settled softly over the valley, dimming the edges of the world into muted shades of blue and gray. Thomas and Daniel stood beside the uncovered house, both of them lingering in silence as the weight of everything they had unearthed slowly settled between them. The house seemed different now, no longer merely a strange artifact revealed by the thaw, but a vessel of memory and meaning. It carried a story that had waited decades, preserved beneath the heavy snow until fate and weather conspired to reveal it. The wind whispered across the exposed roof, weaving through the broken chimney, as though carrying the faint echoes of the family that had once lived there. Daniel remained still for a long time, his eyes fixed on the structure that had shaped the earliest years of his life. His face was marked by a tired solemnity, but beneath it lingered something new and understanding, a fragile sense of completion. He exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cooling air. For Thomas, watching him was like observing someone who had wandered a long distance through unfamiliar terrain and finally recognized a landmark, confirming they had found their way home. When they finally stepped away from the house, they did not venture far. Instead, they walked toward the edge of the property where the ground had cleared enough to reveal a modest stretch of open space. The soil here was soft from the thaw, dark and moist, still adjusting to the sudden warmth. Daniel knelt and ran his fingers lightly across the damp earth, as though sensing the remnants of the world his parents had once walked. He stayed like this for a while before lifting his gaze to the house again. "I want to leave something here," he said quietly. "Something that belongs to them." His hand went to the pocket of his coat where the small silver ring rested. He withdrew it and held it gently in his palm. The tarnished metal glinted faintly in the fading light, the engraved name a silent testament to a childhood frozen in memory. Thomas offered a slow nod, understanding without needing further explanation. The ring was more than a personal relic. It was the only tangible piece of the family story that Daniel still possessed. Leaving it here would be both an offering and a final acknowledgement of the past. They searched the area until they found a modest, flat stone not far from the house. Tomas cleared away debris while Daniel knelt beside the rock, brushing the surface with his sleeve. Beneath the dirt, the stone revealed itself to be smooth and pale, uniquely shaped as though it had always been waiting for this moment. Daniel placed the ring atop it, then stepped back, contemplating it with an expression of quiet reverence. The stone became an unspoken marker, a memorial with no inscription, yet carrying a meaning that far surpassed any words. He looked at Thomas, his voice soft but steady. "I think this is the right way. Not a grave, not a monument, just a place to remember." Thomas agreed in silence, feeling the profound dignity and the simplicity of the gesture. There was no need for elaborate symbols or carved epitaphs. What mattered was that the story, once lost, had now been reclaimed. The rightful heir to that story stood here, choosing to honor it in the most unadorned and honest way possible. As the last of the daylight drained from the sky, a gentle breeze swept across the property, rustling the loose debris around the house. The surrounding pines swayed faintly in the motion, their needles whispering in unison. Tomas felt the moment settle into him, weaving itself into the quiet spaces of his memory. He sensed that the land itself recognized the presence of the living who had returned to acknowledge those who had fled across its frozen expanse long ago. After a while, they returned to the house one final time. Daniel paused at the doorway, letting his fingers rest lightly against the weathered wood. He did not open it. There was no need. Everything he needed to see, he had already seen. Everything he needed to feel had already taken its place in him. He lowered his hand slowly. "I don't know if I'll ever come back here," he said, his voice measured and contemplative, "but I think I could now if I wanted to." This place, it isn't just fear anymore. It's where I started. His words carried the unmistakable tone of resolution, the sort that marks a turning point rather than an ending. Thomas felt something shift inside him, a quiet understanding that this journey had transformed both men in ways neither could fully articulate. For Daniel, it had revived a life buried beneath silence and uncertainty. For Thomas, it had revealed how deeply the past lives within the land and within those who dare to uncover it. They walked together back toward Thomas's house. The ground beneath them was uneven and soft, their footsteps leaving faint impressions that would likely fade by morning, but the symbolic act of walking away together felt permanent. Inside, Thomas brewed a small pot of coffee. The warmth and brief comfort of the shared drink created a simple yet profound space between them. They spoke briefly, not about the hardship of the Nolan family, but about the resilience it had taken for Daniel to confront the truth. Their conversation carried the quiet steadiness of men who understood that some stories demand reverence rather than discussion. Eventually, the time came for Daniel to leave. He stood at the doorway with a calm that had not been present before. His eyes held gratitude deep, sincere, and threaded with a hint of sorrow that would linger but not define him. He extended his hand and Thomas took it firmly. Their handshake held more meaning than any spoken goodbye could capture. "Thank you," Daniel said simply. "You gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever." Thomas nodded. The truth was here. It just needed someone willing to look for it. Daniel offered a faint but genuine smile, then turned and walked toward his car. The headlights illuminated the gravel once more as he started the engine. Thomas stood on the porch, watching as the car rolled slowly down the long, winding path. The vehicle's lights grew smaller and smaller, until finally they disappeared beyond the bend. The silence that followed was deep and full, like the quiet after an old wound has finally closed. He remained outside for a while, letting the cool night settle around him. When he looked toward the excavated house, it no longer appeared as a relic of tragedy, but as a testament to endurance. Half buried in melting snow, it stood like a memorial carved by time itself, its presence firm and unwavering. The land had held the story for decades, preserving it faithfully until the moment came for it to be told. As Thomas finally stepped back inside his home, he felt a strange lightness, as though some small corner of his life had been filled. He knew he would tend to the house in the coming days, checking its stability and making sure it remained protected. Not because it was his responsibility, but because it felt right. The past had been brought into the open, and he would honor its presence in whatever quiet ways he could. The truth of the Nolan family had resurfaced from beneath the frozen weight of winter. In the end, it had found its rightful witness and its rightful heir. And as Thomas drifted into a rare, peaceful sleep that night, he understood that some stories do not fade with the snow. They wait patiently for the thaw until the world is ready to hear them again. If you enjoyed the story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and share this video with your friends. Don't forget to check out the next videos. You won't want to miss what's coming.